Good morning, friends, and welcome to Unfolding the Word this morning. Thanks for joining me as we continue in our study of the book of Genesis. Today I'm going to be reading from chapter 4, the same verses as yesterday actually, but this time focusing in on Abel. Chapter 4, verses 3 to 5. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. Then the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. And so Cain was very angry, and his face fell. We've been looking in this fourth chapter of Genesis at the history's first family, the picture of family life within the framework of a fallen world, as Adam and Eve had been pushed out of the Garden Eden, and the effect of their sin had brought about the fall of the world around them, and the presence of sin and corruption in the society itself, beginning with them and then through their family and then expanding out from there. It wasn't a very pretty picture, really, as we get further into the fourth chapter and follow it. Last time we looked at Cain and his attempt to come to God on his own terms. He believed that it wasn't necessary to come to God on God's terms. He looked at himself as somehow able to offer something else for whatever it was that was causing God's problem with him, whatever was needed to solve sin's dilemma, to find forgiveness, to find reconciliation with God. It was something he could come up with. And so he assumed the works of his hands would be enough to buy his salvation. And you remember our examination of that process and how much it reflects the reality of the way almost everybody views God, if they view him at all, in the world in which we find ourselves. They are confident in their own essential goodness, or at least their own ability to offset and pay for whatever things may be a problem with God, so that ultimately they will be able to be saved and forgiven and go to heaven. But of course, as we study through this fourth chapter, we discover that far from accepting Cain on Cain's terms, God rejected Cain and rejected while he came. He rejected what it represented, and he was left unreconciled. God had no regard, as he put it, for his effort and for his opportunity and offering. Now today, we're looking at his brother Abel and how Abel came about. Because again, the two of them, Cain and Abel, are in a way representative of the human race and the choices that are made by humanity. Abel, as we read in these verses, chose to approach God on God's terms. As we've talked about already, his parents, Adam and Eve, were firsthand taught by God the necessity of what to do to deal with sin, the consequence of sin, the need for forgiveness, what was necessary for reconciliation. And they, in turn, would have taught this to their children, to Cain and Abel, and to all of their children as time would go on. As they taught this process, and as they exemplified it, because we can assume they came with some regularity to God in bringing sacrifice for sin, Abel bought the message. And he bought into the example. He had faith that what God said about it and what his parents were doing about it was in fact the right thing to do. He accepted, in other words, the reality of his own sin and his own problem, his own guilt and his own separation from God for whom he was created. And he also accepted the need for the sacrifice to be placed on the altar as a way of covering sin, at least temporarily, until the ultimate sacrifice of the Lord Jesus Christ. As we read through what was happening in these verses, it becomes crystal clear to us, doesn't it? God accepted Abel's sacrifice. And by accepting it, granted to him the forgiveness that he sought, and also granted to him the reconciliation and relationship with God, despite his sin. God had regard, is the terminology used here. He had regard for Abel's sacrifice. He did not regard or have regard for the sacrifice of Cain. Hebrews 11:4 tells us faith and those who are the exemplars of faith throughout biblical history He talks about Cain in that passage, and God tells us that Abel's faith still speaks for us today. What he did continues to prove itself as useful to teach us fundamentally what it means to have faith and to respond by faith to God. It's accepting what God has to say and coming in the way God says to come. The message, of course, here is that we must approach God on God's terms, not our terms. There is a way that seems right to a man, the end thereof is death, as we read yesterday. Or as John 14:6 puts it, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but through me. There's just one way. There's just one solution. It's exclusive, certainly. But it's God who has defined it, not human beings. And God, in his great love, even creates one. He was under no obligation to even create any solution to our sin, which inevitably separated us ultimately, permanently, and eternally from a holy and righteous and just God. But God, in his love, provided a solution. And we are called upon in faith to accept that solution and come to him on the basis of it. It is faith in what God has said, faith in the work that was achieved on our behalf by the sacrifice, not our works, that has always been the mechanism for forgiveness and reconciliation with God. Works, human works, no matter what we try to do, religious or moral or ethical, they can never pay for sin. They can never solve the dilemma of sin, and they can never ultimately produce forgiveness in humanity. It is sacrifice for sin, atonement for sin, that is the basis for forgiveness. And there's nothing we can do to atone. There's nothing sacrifice we can make that is adequate to offset the consequence of moral outrage in the sight of God over our rebelliousness and sin. All of mankind reflects Abel, or they reflect Cain in how they approach God. All of mankind reflects Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel in that we are all sinners. The Bible tells us all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. There's none who are righteous, no, not one. Everyone falls into that category. But we divide up into two camps in terms of what we do about it. Some come like Abel, God's way. Others, like Cain, come to God on their own terms, on their own way. And here's the great question before us. Are you a follower of Cain or Abel in this whole issue? Are you choosing to come as God prescribes it, or are you coming on your own criteria, believing somehow you are able to do something to solve your sin and force God's hand to accept you? Now, one of the things we also see in this passage, and we're going to talk more about it as we continue in the 4th chapter, is these two options which have created these two categories, Cain's category, Abel's category. These two categories, these two options inevitably create animosity. As we read these verses and go forward from the verses I read to you today, we will discover that Cain hated Abel because God had regard for Abel's sacrifice. And the hatred and frustration that he felt toward Abel eventually led to the murder of his brother. The rejection of God's way inevitably leads people to a rejection of God's people, those who have taken God's way. Think how it's put in 1 John chapter 3, verses 12 and 13. Let me read them to you. We should not be like Cain, who was of the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own deeds were evil and his brothers were righteous. So don't be surprised, brothers, that the world hates you. Now, truly, both Abel and Cain were not righteous in the sense they had sin and it needed to be dealt with. But Abel's sin was dealt with properly, and he was made righteous through the sacrifice coming God's way. But of course, Cain wasn't. And therefore, this clear distinction between being accepted by God or not being accepted by God divided up humanity. Hatred came as a result. In fact, there were a number of consequences, and in the days ahead, we're going to be examining the verses that follow here that talk about 7 of the tragic consequences that came about in Cain's life due to the decision that he made, which are consequences that continue to affect all who make Cain's decision and how they're going to approach God. Whose model are you following? Do you situate yourself in the camp that says, I'm coming to God God's way? Or are you in the camp that says, I'm coming to God on my own terms? There's no middle ground between the camps. I pray that you're coming to God on God's terms, knowing that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and that no one comes to the Father but through him. God bless.